All right, I think we're live.
All right. Welcome, everybody. Thank you for participating in our Sojourn virtual tasting, our very first one. Hopefully, everyone's staying safe and sound out there. You're being joined by Erich Bradley and Randy Bennett, handy dandy dynamic duo of winemaking team here at Sojourn Cellars. Randy and I have been doing this for a long time, I think since 2008 together. But this is the first time we've done one of these, so bear with us. But thank you for joining us. And Randy will reiterate this later, but if you have any questions, please feel free to chat them in, and we'll try and get to them later. Where do we start?
Well, talk about what wines we're tasting.
Yeah, so we chose two of our kind of flagship wines. We got the 2018 Sangiacomo Pinot up against the 2018 Gaps Crown Pinot. And these are two vineyards that really we built this business on, and we know intimately. So the Sangiacomo Vineyard we've been playing with since 2004.
Hey, Eric, just to interrupt real quick, I'm going to attempt to share a map on the screen, see if we can get this to work correctly.
Great, thank you. Anyway, we started playing with Sangiacomo in 2004. Great, I can see the map. It looks great.
Yep.
So if you follow Randy's cursor, you can kind of generally see where these two vineyards are. They're in the northern end of the Petaluma Gap, which gets a lot of cool air directly from the Pacific Ocean. And it helps us retain acidity and makes it a nice long growing season out there. But you don't have to deal with all the natural humidity that's in the air if you're actually closer to the coast, which sometimes can put pressure on the growing season. Things just are wetter, molds, mildew, things like that can grow. But as these vineyards are adjacent to each other physically, Sangiacomo is right at the base of Sonoma Mountain on the western edge, and then Gaps Crown is as you start to go up the hill, up the base of the mountain. So all of it's kind of western facing, but a lot of cold air can get trapped there at the base. That's why it works so well for Pinot. As close as these two vineyards are to each other, they've always made very different wine from each other. So Sangiacomo, we've really capitalized on this kind of creamy mouthfeel, where Gaps Crown's a little bit more structured and has some tannin in it. But both we think are pretty alluring and interesting. And Randy, do you want to maybe share some thoughts on the 2018 vintage, since both of these are 2018s?
Yeah, well, happy to. And also just a couple of interesting differences between the two, even though they're really right across the street from each other, is the Sangiacomo Vineyard, this is on Roberts Road, is kind of a gradual incline, and it's on very similar terrain. It's all in an old creek bed. So all the different blocks that we source from, which are from different clones of Pinot Noir, they have fairly similar soils and terrain, and we pick them very almost on the same day, sometimes all on the same day, sometimes over the course of a couple of days, versus the Gaps Crown is going up the mountainside up to 800 feet elevation, and each block is like a little separate little section of the mountainside, and then we wind up picking those sometimes 2 weeks apart. So it's kind of something that's different from a logistics perspective for us. So I'm going to stop sharing the map here, and hopefully we'll go back.
I like the map better. You can put the map.
I know, we got to look at each other, right? But 2018 vintage. So I was thinking back on this, and one of my fondest memories of the vintage is being introduced to Revision beer. I don't know if you've heard of the Revision beer, but this is like my new favorite IPA. But the brewmaster was at Knee Deep Brewing Company up in Sacramento, and then he created his own brewery in Nevada. And so I remember distinctly in 2018, someone at Broadway Market introduced me to it, and love those beers ever since. So that's one of my favorite memories. My other favorite memory is our Mother Nature was fairly nice to us, especially in September and October with nice, warm, dry weather. There was one little rain, a couple little heat spikes, but pretty minor. So we were able to really pick the grapes when we wanted to. Our hands weren't forced by any major weather events, and we could, get that nice complex flavor development and get the tannins ripe. So, so if you'll notice out of 2018 Pinot Noirs of the region, is you have, really expressive aromatics, and you have really nice silky tannins. And I think you find that in these two wines too. So, matter of fact, I'm going to try a little bit of the Sangiacomo while I'm talking about this.
Great
And
idea.
I encourage everybody else to start drinking as well.
Yeah, I'll add, I would say one thing about 18 that I also liked, and I agree with everything you said, is that, the vines carried some crop in 18.
Yep.
So, that allowed us to get some hang time and some nice, deep, sophisticated flavors. We've had other vintages where sometimes you got to work pretty hard to find those because the grapes just need to come off early. This stuff, I don't remember the exact harvest dates, but I want to say we got into late September on a lot of it, if not.
Actually, I looked them up in preparation. So Sangiacomo Vineyard, we actually picked on October 15th and 16th. We picked the whole vineyard in those 2 days. That's pretty late. It was actually one of the latest vintages in recent history. And then
that's awesome.
In Gaps Crown, we started picking the earliest block on September 21st, and then went September 27th, and then the last block on October 15th as well. So you could see that variation there. But it was a late harvest. It was also, like you mentioned, the higher yielding. There was more fruit hanging, but a really high quality vintage overall. So
yeah, and good uniformity. I mean, it's one of my favorite vintages that we've done together. So I didn't remember that Sangiacomo was that late, but it makes sense to me. I always think we benefit if we can get to the equinox. You get the shorter days, and you get mild ripeness where things aren't moving quite as fast as they are earlier when it could be hot and stay hot overnight. Anyway, wine's tasting pretty good. I like how the mid palate's starting to fill out and show that signature Sangiacomo creaminess. It's still going to get a lot better from here, but I think this is reminiscent for me of stuff we did back in like 08, 09 that have really held up nicely.
One kind of technical difference in this 2018 vintage of Sangiacomo is that we asked the Sangiacomos to replant one block that they were tearing out a Chardonnay block, and they were going to replant it, and we asked them if they would plant a portion of it specifically for us to the Mount Eden clone of Pinot Noir, which is a clone that we like in some other vineyards, and so they did so. And this was the first vintage where we introduced that component into the wine, and I think it really adds a lot of depth and richness to the wine, and kind of brings that into it, and that dark fruit character that I think is really going to adds a lot in this vintage, and will add a lot going forward as well.
Yeah, I agree. I mean, what we've seen so far is it may actually be our strongest component going forward. I think, as hopeful as we were that it was going to be a good fit, it seems like it's superseding my expectations.
Yep.
I think you agree.
Yeah, there's a couple questions that I might just pop in there, some comments and questions. So one question is what clones are in the wine. So Sangiacomo Vineyard is primarily clone 115 out of a couple of different blocks, which tends to have a lot of structure to it, and then clone 777 and a little bit of Swan clone. So the Swan clone, which is originates from cuttings from the Swan Vineyard, which is a historic vineyard in the Russian River Valley, adds this really interesting kind of gamey character to the wine that we kind of have to blend in sparingly because it can dominate the overall character of the wine. So we careful with how we utilize the Swan clone into the vineyard, doesn't it? And then I'll just cover Gaps Crown while I'm at it. So it's clones 115, 667, and 828. So all Dijon clones for the Gaps Crown. Someone also asks, how do these compare to the 2017 versions? So I don't know, Eric, I'll let you kind of take that one.
I mean, these vineyards are both, consistently great. So, irrespective of the vintage, I think the way that we make it, which is pretty hands off, is to make sure that the site, is front and center when you open one of these bottles of wine. So you should be able to tell the vintage differences. 17 was quite a bit hotter than 18 was. So I think the flavor profile and some of the aromatics are maybe a little bit more forward on that wine than the 18 is right now. I suspect the 18 is going to take a little bit longer to get into the zone, or at least needs some more air, but might end up being, an even better wine than 17. And 17, if we didn't have the fires around here that affected, all the stuff that came in super late, people would be talking about it as one of the greatest vintages we've probably ever produced. But everyone wants to talk about the fires. So there's some sleepers in there. I think 17 Pinots are pretty spectacular.
That's actually an interesting thing you brought up, the fires in 17, because that was something about 2018 that was nice, was we didn't have fires in Sonoma County. And
right.
From a personal just anxiety and impact on our community, that was nice after the horrible 2017. So just to geek out a little bit for those that are interested on barrels and oak programs. So a couple things. In general, we make these two Pinot Noirs very similarly. We kind of a similar fermentation process, native yeast, punch downs, open top fermenters. We ferment the blocks all separately within the vineyard, so the different clones will be kept all separate until we decide to blend them. But there are a couple things we do different for each of the wines, and one of them is what barrels we use. We've learned over the years, because we evaluate it every year, and we've learned that certain barrels and certain forests of oak forests in France actually work better with the different wines. So all the Pinot Noir, we use about 50% new French oak barrels. So it's all aged in oak barrels, and about half of them are new barrels versus first time it's being used, versus half being older barrels, neutral barrels. And the Sangiacomo one tends to like these barrels made by Louis Latour. So Louis Latour, one of the great, Burgundy houses, long tradition. They produce their barrels and they export some of them to the United States, and we're fortunate to be able to buy some. And we really like how those barrels, which are all kind of a medium toast, kind of a more finesse-driven barrel, how those impact the Sangiacomo. Gab's Crown, we like. It likes the Francois Ferrer barrel. So you might be familiar with Francois Ferrer as the cooper. It's one of the largest, most popular coopers in the world, or at least in the world of Burgundy. And we like the forests of Vosges and Bertrange. So Francois Ferrer has usually a higher impact barrel, and Vosges and Bertrange tends to add more earthy and kind of more aromatics to the wines versus the Louis Latour. So the Gab's Crown tends to always be kind of bigger, more body, type of a Pinot Noir, and it handles and really benefits from having those higher impact barrels on it. So just wanted to share a little bit of that with you for those interested. Let's see, maybe we should taste the Gab's Crown and move on to that.
Sounds good. I'm actually pleasantly surprised at how expressive this one is. This can sometimes, as you know, take a while to come out of its shell because it's so intense and concentrated for a Pinot, but pushing a lot of red fruit. It's not as dark and brooding as some of the other vintages can be. I don't know, correct me if I'm wrong, but this was one where we had a pretty balanced crop in block 7 in the 667 that we have, that can, sometimes when that holds a really light crop, we've gotten fruit that was so intense that we had to be very measured about how much made its way into the single vineyard wine, because if you put very much in it, it would just take over. But if memory serves me correctly, 2018 held a nice crop in there, and it was a little tempered, but great. So just a more balanced, kind of complete wine on its own. I think that may be showing itself in this wine right now.
Yeah. One thing you can see is you can see Gap's Crown Vineyard right now behind Erich. So Erich is in our in the Sojourn Tasting Salon, and we have this great mural of Gap's Crown Vineyard, and that's one of the 828 Clone 828 blocks there right behind him.
I'd have done it in the vineyard, Randy, as you know, but I didn't trust the Wi-Fi.
Yeah, internet access not quite as good out there. Plus, it'd probably be cold and windy and foggy right now. So
yeah, that would be okay.
Yeah, no, I agree. I think I remember that for sure in 2018. That the Clone 7 block, because normally that is like these little tiny clusters with, it gets a lot of shatter, so about half the berries don't ripen up properly. So it's really creates this really intense wine. But in 2018, it was more balanced. You had not quite as much shatter, so each cluster had more berries on it, and they were all a little bit bigger too.
Yeah, they look normal.
Yeah, it looked like a normal Pinot Noir cluster.
They look like our 115 clusters.
Right. One thing else mentioned on 2018 that makes me think about it is we had a pretty wet winter. We had California, we've gone through a lot of drought years, but in 2018 we had rain in the winter, and that actually caused everything to kind of delay a little bit and help lead to kind of the later ultimate harvest. But that wetter vintage, I think, helped lead to kind of a more balanced crop as well versus the dehydration we experienced for several years. So I'm not sorry, the just not having any water in the ground for several years, the drought. So I think you might have mentioned this, but just in case you didn't, in general, Gap's Crown tends to have a darker fruit profile versus Sangiacomo. I'm sure you guys might be looking at them side by side. I don't know if you can see it, but it's hard to see on the screen. But it's a bluer fruit profile too. So it has like a velvet blue hue to it, and that comes out straight out of the press. You can see the difference between Gap's Crown versus any of the other Pinots that we make. It just has this dark blue fruit versus the red fruit, and the flavor profile tends to follow suit, in my opinion. Kind of you get more like blackberry notes versus the classic.
Yeah, I think it's hillside, right? It's hillside versus Sangiacomo that's got deeper soils. So thinner root systems, they wake up a little earlier. They're more stressed. The fruit's a little more intense. I think totally get that. I see a question about shatter from Chuck.
Yeah.
Do you want to take that? You want me to take it?
You can take it.
So shatter is kind of a colloquialism that gets used by winemakers and grape growers. Essentially, it means there's a bad pollination, or there was a problem with pollination. So during bloom period, which is typically somewhere around late May, sometimes early June, depending on the year, the flower clusters are exposed. They pollinate. The ones, or at least the ones that do get pollinated, turn into grapes, and the ones that don't become these little green acid balls that have no flavor. And in theory, maybe they can add a little bit of acid to the wine. I think most of them just sink to the bottom of the tanks, just like the seeds do, and maybe release a little bit of acid during the press, depending on how hard you press it. But we don't press that hard. So kind of not much of an effect, other than the cluster that ordinarily would weigh maybe 1/3 of a pound or, 1/4 of a pound or something in between, can weigh a lot less. It accumulates sugar faster, and in theory, at least, it gets ripe a little bit faster. So Randy was referencing block 7, which is 667 over at Gap's Crown, and how oftentimes we've had to deal with shatter in there. We're not quite sure why. That's not one of the rockier sections of that vineyard, and it's more towards the bottom. But that has been the case almost all the time, and that's led to some crazy intense wine. But not the case at 18.
So we're going to kind of start to wrap up a little bit, but if anyone has any questions, feel free to chime in on the chat line. I do have one question here, which was, during this shelter in place period that we're in right now, what are some of the more unique bottles of wine we may have opened and what are we enjoying? So I personally try to get on I'm going to open a bottle of wine a night, but my wife and kids are not with me, and it's pretty hard to do that on your own. So
Perfect.
I've failed at it, but I made an attempt, but I haven't been able to get there. But I have drank some interesting wine. So actually, um, I Craig, Sojourn, one of the Sojourn founders and proprietor, was nice enough to source some great ribeye steaks. So we had some great Burgundy. I had a 2002 Joseph Drouin Charme Chambertin, which was fantastic, with a nice prime ribeye recently. So that was one of my favorites. Anything you want to share, Erich?
Well, my wife has a bubbles affliction. So shelter in place for us has meant a lot of champagne. And I can't say that we've opened anything with a lot of age on it, but we've been plowing through all the grower champagnes, pardon me, that we have in the wine cooler at home. And yeah, I can report back that there's lots of good stuff out there. Every day, bottle of bubbles.
Right. Champagne every day. I think a lot of people are happy with that. A couple other questions. So what's the opportune time to drink the wines? You want to take that one, Erich?
Sure. I tend to like aged wine personally, but I think this stuff is engineered so that if you're laying it down for 2 or 3 years, it's in a really friendly space. If you don't have that kind of patience, you're not going to get punished if you go at it earlier. But I would love it if people stashed away a few bottles and stored them properly, because I'm finding right now, like, our 2010s are drinking amazingly well. Yeah. We cracked 2010 Ridgetop and 2010 Sangiacomo side by side at Thanksgiving last year, and I was very, very happy with that. And I think the 2010 Gaps are amazing, and Wohler. So if you and I think there's gas in the tank on those, so yeah, I don't feel like I'm in a rush to get to the rest of them. Yeah. So I would hope that people had the wherewithal to lay these down, but I understand if you can't wait that long.
Yeah. Another question was, what gives the Sangiacomo wine the sweet tones? They mentioned not sugar, but I definitely agree. I've noticed that on the Sangiacomo wines, and it's really about, I think, the ripeness of the fruit, and that getting that hang time. In both Sangiacomo and Gaps Crown, frequently you'll kind of get this sweet character, even though there's no sugar. They're all fermented completely dry, so there's no residual sugar. But when you're able to get the hang time in the grapes and get that that kind of complex flavors, and the tannins get riper, you get this sensation of sweetness out of the kind of expressive fruit.
Yeah, and I'll add, I think when you get it ripe, you also get kind of glycerin that ends up, and it really impacts the mouthfeel that we've talked about with respect to Sangiacomo as well. But there is a perceived sweetness that's also delivered, I think, by the glycerin, just from being able to get it ripe, just like you said. The hang time is the secret.
Yeah. Also, someone wanted to clarify the clones. So Gaps Crown is clones 115, 667, and 828. So those are the Gaps Crown clones, and then the Sangiacomo was clones 115, 777, Swan, and then the new Mount Eden clone as the new component. All right. One of the last question we have so far is, what's our all-time favorite food and wine pairing? This was from our new director of marketing, Laurel. So
Laurel.
I thought I had time to think about it, and I had an interesting experience. Was we were experimenting with having some nice food and wine pairing in the tasting salon, and the chef came up with this dish that I never would have thought about, and it was called lentils de puy. So it was lentils that were cooked in this black garlic that I don't know the whole history of black garlic, but it's buried or something in the ground for a while or something, and it's fermented. And anyway, it was great. I mean, as a whole, it was really nice. But we went through about 5 different Pinot Noirs that we make, to see what, how each one paired with it to kind of decide what was best. And it was an amazing kind of epiphany how I remember it was a 2016 Wooler Vineyard Pinot Noir. It just head and shoulders above the rest. It kind of just exploded with the pairing. So that was a very unique pairing to me, like something I probably wouldn't normally have eaten, and just to think about pairing with Pinot. So that was great. You can have these great experiences with food and wine pairing, and that was one for me.
Good. I'll quickly try and answer it. The best single pairing I've ever had was at a restaurant up in Seattle called Canlis, Canlis. Fantastic place if you've never gone. Where they called it a mushroom cappuccino. Essentially, it was a roasted mushroom puree soup. It didn't have any cream in it, but it felt like it did because it was so luxurious. I believe it was just a little mushroom stock that they did it with, but they served it in a cappuccino cup. It had a little froth on it. They put a little dab of truffle on top, and they served it with I think it was a Sojourn Sangiacomo Pinot, and it was lights out. I don't know, transported me. I'll never forget it.
Cool. Let's see. A couple other questions popped in. What beef cut goes best with your Pinot? What do you think, Erich?
Well, I'd just take the best beef cut I could find, which is usually going to be a bone-in ribeye, as far as I'm concerned. What do you think?
I definitely have had our Pinots with a lot of bone-in ribeye, and it really does really well. I think that extra little fattiness in there kind of goes well with the Pinot, and our Pinots tend to have enough acidity to kind of cut through it and really,
That said, I think you and I would both probably take a good bone-in ribeye with some motor oil.
Yeah.
So I don't know how much of it has to do.
A little biased by the cut. Yeah. Another question: what advantages to open vat fermentation?
You want me to go?
Yeah, go for
it. I mean, there are a few. The biggest one is probably you're losing a little bit of evaporation, and you're getting some air exchange early on in the fermentation that can help with color stabilization. There are some other technical advantages to it, but there are some disadvantages and risks as well that you take on when you do it that way. Sometimes it's nice to have things protected, but Pinot just generally behaves better in an open top tank. I think that's the biggest reason why we do it in there. We've tried everything else, and there's nothing that compares to it.
Yeah, I mean, the temperature kind of tends to not get as extreme. It's easier to control temperature if you don't want the temperatures to get too hot, which we really don't in Pinot Noir. We want to get the kind of more elegant flavors, and so I think that's a nice advantage of it overall. And you don't get as intense of an extraction out of the skins and seeds in open top.
I personally just like to look at it and be able to stick my head, in the tank and smell it. There's some just advantages to connecting with the fermentations that way too.
Cool. All right. Well, I think we better wrap up. So I just want to say thank you again to everyone for joining us, and hopefully you enjoyed it. We are going to host another one of these in next week on the 8th, and we're going to talk about Wallala and Rogers Creek vineyards. So feel free to join us for that if you can. And Erich, do you have anything else to say to wrap up?
No, Randy, thank you for moderating, and thank you everybody for joining us. Cheers. Be safe.
All right.
See you next week, hopefully.
Cheers, everyone.
Cheers.
Bye-bye.